Hi everyone! Welcome to the second part of making my Regency dress. In the first part we already made the bodice and attached the sleeves. In this part we're going to attach the skirt, the belt and finish everything off. It might actually sound quite simple. I thought it was, but it turned out that it wasn't. Projects always go a bit different than you anticipate at first. But without further ado, let's start sewing. We start the skirt by first attaching the two back panels together up until the mark. The top is left open. Because this synthetic satin is a rather fray prone fabric, all seams will be finished with at least a zigzag. After that, we can start the pleats. I quite like doing pleats because it can be as simple as pulling up the first thread trace mark and putting it on the second. The look it gives is nice and crisp as well. After pinning, the pleats are basted in place and we can start on the long seams. The front is stitched to the two side backs and that is again sewn to the back we worked on earlier. And all it says for the next step is to attach the bodice to the skirt part, right sides together. So let's just do that. It looked quite straightforward at this point, but spoiler alert, it was not. Now that the skirt is attached to the back of the bodice, we can finish the back. The pattern doesn't mention a whole lot about it, it just says finish and tack down the edges of the folded over portion of the center back bodice overlap on the inside. This is the center back line and this is the overlap line, and if we fold this over, it ends just where the last pleat ends. So basically the entire portion after the pleat also gets folded over because that is just seam allowance. The way that that looks on the inside is just like this. Considering we already finished this edge, I think I'm just going to tack it down like this, because if I fold it over again to make it look pretty, it gets really bulky because we have the silk and the lining and so I'm just going to fold it over like this and then stitch that all down by hand. Before I'm actually going to sew down all of this, I noticed something else. Namely that this seam is straining a bit. So I'm going to reinforce this first by sewing over it a few times. I'm going to check if I have any silk thread in the color that resembles this, because then I'm going to be using silk for this, just as I would if I were making a buttonhole. If I look at what my grandma wrote on these bins, it says this should all be pure silk. So let's see if there is anything in here that resembles the dress color. If there's nothing else, I guess I'm going to use that one. Yeah, that's all more pinks. So we can use that one. I'm going to put this back and then we can sew it in. By now you might have noticed what exactly was going wrong. The problem is that this line and this line are both the center back. I was going to make it with an overlap, which means that everything outside of the center back was going to overlap. But the skirt is supposed to close together. Then the back also aligns, while what I want is that it is overlapping with the two lines for the center back on top of each other. But then we also have the skirt overlapping, which means that we have an unequal amount of pleats on one side compared to the other side. You might think, well, why don't you then just line up the back? But the problem is that the bodice was supposed to not have this extra length. So if I just keep it like this, my bodice will be way too big. I have come up with a sort of solution. It's not the most pretty thing. And I thank the costume Discord for thinking along and suggesting the eventual fix. I was already thinking that I could just overlap it like this and have the center backs align again, like that. This way I can just add buttons like I originally wanted, and the bodice is the right width. However, right now we do see that there is an unequal amount of pleats on this side compared to that side. I mean, the actual part here doesn't matter that much. We will get a belt over it. Like this, it is already less obvious, but we still have the unequal amount of pleats. I know at an event no one is going to stand here and just plainly stare at my butt and count all the pleats, but still, I want it to be less obvious than this. When I asked for this problem in the costume Discord, your sewing buddy came up with a great solution, namely to add a butt bow. To add a decorative bow with long trails, that already obscures this a tiny bit more. And I guess if we stack all those little solutions on top of each other, I think this is salvageable. Also, to explain what should have happened, what was supposed to be done is that this line for the center back ended up here, so that this is the part that was sticking out over it. Basically, I put my skirt on too wide. The skirt was supposed to be smaller. I counted the pleats right. I think there is exactly the right amount of pleats in here that should be, so I don't know where else I went wrong. I must also say that the instructions are not the most clear thing on this. It just says it has to overlap a bit. And the picture that they show of it sticking out is before you flap over this part. So yes, I had a bit sticking out. But yeah, after that they just say flap it over. They don't mention that the center back has to align with the end of the skirt. So that's it for this probably lengthy explanation bit. We can now just continue constructing the dress as normal, which means that the next part is to make the belt. So let's get started on that. For the construction of the belt, we baste the interfacing to one of the strips. Place it on top of the other strip, right sides together. And stitch all around, but leaving open a 7 to 10 cm gap in one of the sides. After cutting short the seam allowance, we can turn both ends through the gap, and after a quick press, the remaining hole is sewn shut by hand. Next up are the belt loops. For the chain itself, I take a few strands of sewing thread and zigzag over them, creating a stronger thread than if I would just use the sewing thread by itself. So we've got the threaded chain. I marked where I want the belt loops to be, and no, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I guess I'm just going to try and insert them here. Sew this in here. And then the other. I also have no idea yet how I'm going to attach this on the inside without it fraying away again. I think what I'm going to be doing is actually relatively simple. I'm going to make a knot in here with the chain, just by stitching through the seam allowance only. There we go. This way it is at least attached to the seam allowance in a way that it can't move on this side anymore. We also have to make sure that the belt loop on the bottom is correct. Let's see. I think we want a little bit less than this. Something like this should be okay. Now we also got some seam allowance here, so we can also make a knot with this in the seam allowance. There we go, that's technically one belt loop on one side. It's attached securely on both sides, so now we can just loop a belt in here. Here we go with the current state of the dress and the bodice. I still need to finish the hem and I need to put the buttonholes in at the back. So for that, because we are going to do some weird stuff with the overlaps, so I decided to do a fit first so we can determine exactly where the buttonholes and the buttons should end up. At the front, I think it looks pretty okay. I am currently wearing the stays underneath and just a regular top because I didn't feel like putting on the chemise. And I think it actually looks quite nice from the front, because the back is quite a mess. The thing is that I messed up the attachment of the skirt to the bodice, but apparently, and also looking back to the footage of the bodice mock-up, the back was already too big. So the overlap became even more than I anticipated, which means that eventually we ended up with this. So yeah, we're not having many pleats left over. Or rather, almost none. However, I do think that in general, skirt really is too long. In general, I do think the silhouette is there, and that's one of the more important things. What I will do now is I'm going to put in the buttonholes and the buttons as they were pinned on right now. But yeah, it's actually really comfortable. I also immediately noticed, I mean, it's not the warmest in here. With the short sleeves it's quite cold. So this is the moment that I realized that eventually I might actually need to make a Spencer. But we'll see about that later. First of all, we actually gotta finish this dress. After asking my partner to pin me in, this is the result that we got. Which is basically that the overlap goes from here all the way over there. This way it fits me semi-snugly, as in it just fits. But yeah, that means that I really only have 2 pleats left. I have no idea where it went this wrong, because this also means that the overlap is even more than just the part that we're missing from the normal overlap. Which means that the bodice basically still was too big in the first place. There are a few things I can do. Unpicking everything, including the pleats, making it into a gather, and just gathering it to a very tiny part. Which means that we'll get a lot of volume here, which is not a bad thing. However, with the amount of fraying going on in this fabric, I'm afraid that if I unpick the seam allowance and the seam and redo everything, that my fabric will be frayed before I have everything together again. So honestly, I don't really think that that is an option. Plus, it's all together already. I just don't really feel like redoing half the dress. What we are going to do is put the overlap all the way like this, remeasuring the center of the back. I'm going to take the middle and then put the buttonholes and buttons over there. And then we can put the buttons like this, because I think 4 buttons like this is nice. 5 would be a bit too much. For the explanation of how to make the buttonholes, I actually grabbed the instructions from the fancy blouse that I made earlier this year, because it has a great explanation on how to hand make buttonholes. The first step is to sew a box around the area of which you want the buttonhole to be. Next up, the buttonholes can be opened up. Then after that, we will overcast the edges to prevent fraying. Then after that, we can use either silk or cotton embroidery thread to make the actual buttonholes. This is always the scary bit. I put in a needle so I can't slip and make a giant buttonhole. Now let's see if that's big enough. Yep, we can continue. Now that all the buttonholes are done, the next step is to determine where the buttons themselves need to be. For that we can overlap the bodice to the pins that my partner put in. And then to see where the buttons themselves need to be, I grab a pin and I insert that into the buttonhole, like that. This way, when we take out the pin, we can actually use it as if this were a button. And well, the button needs to be there, somewhere there. Then we can finish up the hem. I decided to have a slightly shorter hem on the front than on the back, to make walking a bit easier. I set the mannequin to be my height and pin up the hem while measuring distance from the floor. Once the hem was pinned to a length I liked, we can cut off the excess, leaving a seam allowance of about 4 cm. Because of the fray proneness, I zigzag the bottom edge before turning it over so it is doubled up. The next task is again a rather big one, as we have to hand finish the entire hem, which is almost 3 meters of hem. And to make it even more interesting, I'm going to use a stitch I have never used before, which is a catch stitch. I figured with the weight of the hem and the slight stretchiness of the fabric that a catch stitch would be a nice way to fix this. But I have never used this before, so this is interesting. I'm trying to only grab a tiny piece of the top fabric, as in the outside fabric. And here I'm trying to catch both sides of the folded over hem, but not the outside fabric. The most difficult part of this, I guess, is getting the stitches that are going to be visible on the outside to get them nice and even, because I already see that these ones that are luckily on the inside are not that even. To finish off the back, we're going to make a big bow in the back. Measure out 20 by 40 centimeters, and then I can cut that. The actual sewing of the bow is going to be quite simple. We're just going to flip this over and sew this edge. After turning it inside out, iron it nice and flat so the seam is nice on the top. Then we can fold it again, this time lengthwise. Because this edge will stay exposed, it's better to cut off the loose threads and finish this one nicely. In my case, just with a regular zigzag. There we go, one zigzagged edge. That means that we can now turn this inside out again. I'm going to put the seam in the middle of the back. And now all we have to do is make a little strap for the front, which can hold the bow in place. Then with the seam in the back, I can grab a bit of leftover fabric. I cut this for the bias strips originally, but I cut too much bias strip. I can just stitch this together to form a tube and then turn that inside out again. After sewing it together, I turned it inside out and I gave it a good press. Now all we need to do is to scrunch this together and see how much we are going to need. Something like that. And as you can see, that's already starting to become an actual bow. Now we can cut this off and sew it together. We're not really going to be bothered by finishing everything off neatly, because this will be at the back anyway. So it doesn't really matter if there is some seam finishing here. For the tails of the bow, I reused the pattern piece of the belt, as I quite like the length and width of it. After putting two pieces on top of each other, right sides together, I cut off the bottom so it tapers into a nice point, and sewed it all around the outer edge. Then I cut short the seam allowance, taking care to cut the corners even shorter. Turn them inside out and give them a press, and you've got yourself some tails. Well, that's a first. I managed to win a game of thread chicken. My spool's completely empty. And this is all I had left over, which I think might actually even be enough to sew the bow to the skirt. But this was all the great thread I needed for the entire skirt, so this game I won. To finish the belt, I attached some hooks and eyes. No fancy stitches, just making sure it is attached and not visible on the other side. After attaching the hooks and eyes and sewing over the ends of the tails, we can finally assemble everything. First of all, I'm going to add the tails to the back in such a way that the points go outward. And then I will sew these on, and after that I can add the bow on top of it. There we go, the bow is on. I sewed all around the edges. You can see it at the back. It's definitely not the prettiest bit of sewing, but you don't see a lot of that. I also managed to stab myself with the back of the needle. So that's the thing. But anyway, the bow is on and it's quite nice and floofy. And that means with this, my Regency evening dress is done. And with that, the dress is finished. All in all, I'm really happy with how it turned out. The fixes that I had to make actually made the dress better, I think. The butt bow at the back really adds a nice touch of decoration, and I'm really happy that I had to think about that and actually had to make it, because it finishes off the otherwise relatively simple dress, I guess. I mean, there's decoration up top, but for the rest it's quite a simple thing. So I think that bow was a really nice touch. All in all, what I thought of this pattern, the Laughing Moon number 138 Ladies Regency Gown. It's a pretty okay pattern. It does the job. I mean, there are definitely enough pictures to show you what you should do, but some things could have been explained a bit clearer. As you can see, I messed up quite big with the overlap at the back, and there were other things where either I had to stand and think about it for 5 minutes on how they actually wanted me to do it, or other things that I had to redo once or twice. And I even chose the most simple option of this pattern, because that is a really nice thing about this pattern. It comes with so many options. As you can see, there are many options for sleeves, bottom trims, all that you can want basically. Personally, I would say this pattern, for me also, this was the very first time working with historical patterns instead of contemporary day-to-day patterns like this. So the construction is a bit different than what I'm used to. As you can see, I managed, and I think the result is quite pretty. If you're very new to sewing, I might not recommend this pattern. If you're an intermediate sewer and you do not mind having to think about how to construct things, I can recommend this pattern. So yeah, that's it. This outro might be a bit longer than usual, but I really did want to mention that I had some problems with this pattern. But all in all, it's pretty okay. So yeah, that's it for this pattern. All in all, I think this dress is already being used for more stuff than I anticipated. Last year when the Foundations Revealed competition was announced, I had already thought, oh, that might be nice to participate, and then I completely forgot about it. And last summer a Regency LARP was announced. I really wanted to make something for that already, even though there was no date yet. Still don't have any, still looking forward to it. So that's when I got the idea of making a Regency ensemble. I found a really nice fashion plate that I wanted to use, which I promptly completely forgot about. I started this dress, refound the fashion plate, added these stripes because of that, and then I was reminded of the Foundations Revealed competition, which, considering the theme and considering the fact that I'm making a Regency dress, it fit. So I decided that my first attempt at historical wear would be a nice reason to enter. So that's it. You could, because of that, already see a sneak peek of the dress, and that's why I'm going to finish it up here. So all in all, I'm really happy with this project, and I'm looking forward to finally be able to wear it at the Regency LARP. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear them in the comments, and see you guys next time.